Welcome to another edition of Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to explore the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, the top story of this week was unquestionably the call going up nationwide in the wake of protests and riots to defund the police, or even to abolish the police, as some have it.
Well, yeah, it's a heck of a way to begin by saying it's the unquestioned story of the week, because there was a lot of stories this week.
There were a lot of stories.
A lot of them that continue from previous weeks. Even as we record this, there was the day we record this here on Thursday, lots of reports of coronavirus spikes again. It desperately impacted the market on Thursday. It dropped about, I think, 1,700 points, one of the largest drops. One-day drops. There's a lot going on, and yet this is really a fascinating development. What started as protest with a mantra, "I can't breathe," which was, of course, the last words of George Floyd to the people who killed him, now has turned into a cry of defund the police or abolish the police.
That's
a major
Minneapolis
shift.
Police Department, where this is, sort of the epicenter of the whole thing, actually pledged on Sunday to dismantle their police department, promising a whole new system.
Right, and then in Seattle, you actually had police forces standing down as a left-leaning force kind of takes over downtown. Right,
we'll talk about CHAZ in a minute.
Well, you might have to introduce that. I mean, so it's interesting, because I think this falls into the category of when somebody says defund the police, the first thing we have to ask is, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, do you mean what the Minnesota or the Minneapolis City Council meant, and especially the spokesperson who answered a question this week by saying the ability to call the police is a white privilege? Right. Is that what we mean, or do we mean what happened in New Jersey, right? What's the town in New Jersey? Canton, New Jersey, right? Where they essentially didn't defund in sense of abolish, but they basically took out the structure that was there and replaced it with a better structure. And we've seen remarkable police reform in cities around the country. Maybe not necessarily as dramatic as all that, but a difference. And some people, that's what they mean by defund is, defund this aspect or defund this aspect to demilitarize. Or, does it mean what we saw in Seattle, which is a developing story? And I don't even know what to say about it, other than it just seems to get kind of crazier and crazier there. And government officials who have allowed kind of that lawlessness to have a presence for a while seem, pretty powerless or unwilling to do anything about that.
Yeah, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I'm just expecting the guillotines to show up, Madame la Guillotine to show up any second now.
Well, you want to start singing Les Mis songs, but this isn't exactly the same thing. And tell people about that, though, because I don't know if everyone knows. Maybe by now they do, but this is bizarre. And
in Seattle, Washington, protesters have cordoned off this area around Capitol Hill with barricades and are calling it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ for short. And they say they plan to stay until this list of demands are met, including defunding and abolishing the police department. And by that, they really mean it literally. They're not using it as sort of code for something else. There are paramilitary checkpoints with self-appointed guards with, AR-15s that block the entry to anywhere around Capitol Hill there, and they've got barricades. So it really looks.
I think they're collecting taxes, right? I mean, I think
they're extorting the local businesses, right? Yeah.
I mean, you can't make this up. This is like what who was that? Papa Doc in Port-au-Prince, Haiti? This is what, this, you don't even know, I saw that facial expression. You don't even know what I'm talking about. Right,
I don't
know
what you're talking
about.
You
don't know. No, but it's kind of the slumlord sort of thing. And, I have, there are plenty of people trying to assure everyone it's not that bad. And the media is losing their mind over something that's not credible. But the point is, the media is not losing their mind, because the media is not even talking about this. This is a conversation happening on Twitter, the new media by and large. Yeah, it's just a strange sort of development. And but look, I think we need to get at the heart of this, because the gut level conservative reaction is going to be to respond, with an qualified support of the police, and those who have brought our attention to issues of police brutality, not just against African Americans, but even in general, but especially against African Americans, are going to say, well, I don't mean what's happening in Seattle, but something needs to change. And I tell you what it made me think of this week, Shane, is Chuck Colson. A lot of things make me think of Chuck Colson. You know, I have a bracelet, WWCD. What would Chuck do? Or maybe what would Chuck say? But he thought about these things in terms of prison reform.
Of course.
Right? The narrative when he emerged was, are you going to be tough on crime or are you going to be soft on crime? And he said, you know what, there's a third way. That's the narrative now when it comes to policing. And the idea that a society doesn't need a police force or some sort of check is a utopian fantasy. There's not a singular community in the history of the world that is without the fall, that doesn't need some sort of accountability that way. Now, have we seen throughout history some societies more morally able to govern themselves so that policing, changed dramatically or shrunk? This is one of the major things that happened out of Wilberforce's reforms in pre-Victorian England, is that the police force shrunk. And this was at a
time. Yeah, the conscience or the constable. I don't know who coined the phrase, but it's one we use a lot.
Well, it is, but that's a remarkable thing, because pre-Victorian England was a terrible place to live. But see, what happened wasn't a reform in policing, although that was like a fruit, not a root. The root was a reformation of virtue. And so when we start talking about, things like abolishing police or at least dramatically reducing police, the question has to be, well, are we able to govern ourselves? And I think the obvious answer to that is no. That doesn't mean, however, that there's not a good bit of reform. And that's what, Chuck Colson said. Here you have a group of people in prisons who deserve to be in prisons because of things that they had done. And yet there were ways that they were being treated harshly. There were things that were being allowed to go on. There was abuse that was being allowed. And he said, there's a third way. And I think that this is a very important conversation. And there is a clear third way that needs to be pursued, or maybe a number of third ways, depending on the health and well-being of a community, that needs to be pursued.
That was one of the first things that struck me about Chuck coming on with the Colson Center. It was actually before it was called the Colson Center, was that he was sort of the conscience of the law and order right, where it wasn't just a lock him up and throw away the key mentality. There was a call for prison reform coming out of prison fellowship in Chuck's work. He always quoted the statistic where, he said, when I got out of prison after Watergate, there was the X amount of prisoners. And it was some very small number compared to what it is. And then he said, now
it was 250,000 to 2 million was the
now
jump.
It's in now it's 3.5 million, something in that range is what he used to quote. And that was the basis for his call for reform in the prison system. And prison reform goes hand in hand with reform in policing. And that's a very conservative thing to call for. I think we need to be really, really careful, despite the terrible choice of slogan here for this movement to abolish the police or defund the police. Well, nobody, I don't think anyone who's serious wants to, or rather intellectually credible, wants to abolish the police. But this phrase is standing in for a lot of valid calls for police reform. David French, for instance, conservative writer, brought up several great ideas like abolishing civil asset forfeiture and qualified immunity and all kinds of other abuses that lead to not only over-incarceration, but the kind of potentially systemic racism problems that we're seeing in the police forces. And I think that this is a very pro-police thing to do, right? It's straightening out the system, making it more efficient, making it more just. It'll improve the reputation and the job performance of police around the country. So yeah, I love what a colleague of ours said today or earlier this week in a meeting that we had, John. He said that first thing we need to do is denounce the phrase abolish the police or defund the police, because that's not what we're after. And we should
it's nonsense. That's a nonsensical phrase. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there's not changes that can be made and should be made for the good of everyone. And this is something I think we can, that folks can lead on. I want to spend just a moment on one of those suggestions, and that has to do with qualified immunity. We have a number of institutions across America that enjoy qualified immunity. So our producer, Steve Ryder, we talked about him a couple weeks ago, just having lost his wife and not being able to see her because of rules that the hospital had that were not keeping up to date with the reality on the ground of COVID-19. And what he's found out since is that the hospital she's in, because it's a teaching hospital, has qualified immunity. So even though that he was done wrong.
Explain for our listeners what that means for those who don't.
Well, it just means you can't get in trouble for doing something wrong.
For something your boss told you to do, right? As long as it's according to policy, you can't get in trouble.
According to policy,
moves,
yeah. But it's such a squishy category, right? There's a good bit of discretion involved, and this is what we're seeing with the police. So the police are able to, there's videos popping up. I was watching a video right now earlier today, and a guy gets pulled over going 60 and a 50, right? And the cop threatens to pull him out of the car and pepper spray him, and this guy's staying calm, and videotaping the whole thing, but going, do you realize what's happening? And the guy goes, well, I can do that because I can remove anybody from their car for any reason. So here you have this policy that is so big you can drive a Mack truck through it, right? And so loose and so porous that you can justify any decision, and that's the problem. But the deeper problem is that it treats an entity or an individual as if they don't need to be accountable or responsible to anyone.
Right.
And no one should live unaccountable and not responsible to someone. Do I need to bring up the TSA again? Do I need to bring that up? Because they're an example of qualified immunity.
I have a little timer, and I know by a certain point in each episode, you will bring up the TSA.
Well, I think it makes actually my point. But the police enjoy a level of qualified immunity that, for example, that makes them unaccountable. Now, look, no one is saying here that the vast majority of policemen are bad people trying to do bad things. No one is saying here that they're not under an incredible amount of pressure, increasingly in certain communities where there's high levels of crime. And there's all kinds of these things to bring into it. But that doesn't mean like improvement can't be made. And so, look, the best way, I think, to defend safety, public safety, is to have a virtuous citizenry. You can't ever do it without that. Like you can have the most militarized police that you want, and you're not going to protect citizens if the citizens themselves aren't virtuous. At the same time, a militarized police, what I'm hearing some is cops saying that, what I'm hearing today is that some public officials are saying that's what we need to do, is we need these police to come in and knock heads and that sort of stuff. Look, if you are in a community in which that's the solution to your problem, you haven't solved the problem. You've just revealed how bad the problem is, right? In other words, that's not a long-term sustainable thing.
Yeah, there shouldn't be an us versus them mentality in the police to begin with. That's really unhealthy and toxic.
No, that's right. And you know this because the public officials that you know that are there to serve and protect, when you meet them, and you see what they're trying to do. And you know what, for as many videos as there are of cops, abusing their authority, there's wonderful videos of cops doing wonderful things as well. And this stuff can be made systemic at some level. Yeah. And part of that is, at least in the George Floyd case, is you got to take care when a cop has 16 complaints against him that goes back. This qualified immunity means he doesn't get in trouble. And that's one of the reasons that has to go.
We got to take a quick break here. We'll be right back after this to talk more about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week. Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, two of the other stories that were obviously tied with this, we mentioned the CHAZ thing in Seattle, but we've also got this ongoing issue of systemic racism and white privilege. And we get a lot of questions here about this particular issue. To what extent is critical race theory, white privilege, are these concepts that Christians can, interact with? Can we appropriate these and harmonize them with a Christian way of thinking about the world? And I think it's a really good question, and we should have a discussion about that, because this is the real complaint, right? It's not George Floyd and other instances of police brutality and injustice. Those aren't those are the focal points, but the larger issue is this complaint that the police as a whole are, and the justice system as a whole, are subject to injustices. So let's talk about white privilege, critical race theory. How do Christians deal with this stuff? Yeah,
let's do it as two white guys, right? I mean, what could go wrong? No, it's an important question, and I think even the phrase critical race theory needs. I mean, first of all, everything needs to be defined. That's one of the first things that we say, is that worldviews get smuggled in through definitions.
Question: what do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that? I'm telling you, it's the most useful question that you can have. And even the fact that we're talking about critical race theory, and I would suggest before we look at critical race theory, we look at critical theory. Because critical race theory is specifically looking and trying to apply critical theory in the area of race. But critical theory itself and intersectionality and all the things that go along with it are actually ideas that basically take any a perceived oppressed minority class and gives that group moral authority simply on the case that they are oppressed, and the oppressors, and what that means is not somebody that is currently oppressing, but someone that is part of a class that has historically oppressed the oppressors. They lose moral authority, and intersectionality comes because we all belong to a multiple, set of groups, right? So I might be, for example, white, but I might be female, and that changes the power balance. There's two power balances there that have to be considered. Or maybe I'm, a sexual minority, an LGBT, or maybe I'm impoverished as opposed to, upper class. And so there's just a number of these factors, and essentially you try to weigh them out, and that's really what critical theory. First thing I want to say is we have got a set of What Would You Say videos, new series that we've done that deal with these two questions. And as folks come to breakpoint.org, we'll link to it there at the show notes. Critical theory in and of itself is incompatible with the Christian worldview on a number of levels, and we can talk about what those levels are. On the flip side, I do think we're struggling right now because just because we say critical theory itself is illegitimate as a tool, as a way of seeing the world, certainly as a theory of everything, which it's quickly becoming, is the way you see literally everything.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that things like racism and even systemic racism, although it may not mean everything that critical race theorists mean, that systemic racism doesn't exist. And I think we've got a problem in which people are using critical theory, including Christians, to try to see the world, and it's incompatible at heart with a Christian worldview. On the flip side, people are finding critical theory under every rock. It's now the boogeyman that's keeping us from actually identifying problems that do actually exist. And they don't exist because critical theory, they exist because we're fallen human beings, and there's a whole layer of both individual and systemic consequences of sin because of that. And that's kind of the line that I felt like last week, Chris Brooks and Andy Crouch helped us walk through, talking about the difference, for example, Chris did, between the phrase Black Lives Matter and the group
And the
Black
organization,
Lives Matter.
right, yeah.
And talking about what critical theory gets wrong. And then the personal experience and the cultural realities of racism that our friend Pastor Chris Brooks sees, far too clearly. We can do both. Do both.
Yeah, and we can do both precisely because bad theories often begin with real injustices. Like they notice real things about the world that need to be dealt with, and the evidence for things like systemic racism is real. That there is racism in the world, in our country in particular, and in our history, and that continues to plague us. And you look at the individual stories and experience of Black Americans, that's worth listening to. Yeah. We should be listening to that and acknowledging what's going on there. And that's something that Pastor Brooks was very good on. Another pastor friend of mine actually on Facebook posted about this whole issue and how how we as Christians can think about it. And he noted that white Americans are often too eager to declare premature victory over America's racist past, that this is just something we can, kind of sweep under the rug and put behind us. But so many of our Black brothers and sisters are saying, no, it's something that still affects us. We have to continue to deal with it. On the other hand, when we're talking about critical theory as it's applied to race, we can see it eating itself in real time. There was this great Quillette article that we sent around in our editorial team about a critical race professor or a critical theory professor who specialized in this thing called securitization, which it's complicated to explain. But he was excoriated by other critical race theorists they claimed that his particular brand of critical theory had racist underpinnings and assumptions. And so it's just like a snake eating its own tail kind of thing. And I think it comes down to, John, the reason it does that is I think it's Abolition of Man is where C.S. Lewis says this. We have to bring in C.S. Lewis and the TSA in every episode. That's just our tradition.
It's the rule.
Right. Yeah. But he says that, it's nice to see through things culturally, but you can't go on seeing through everything forever, because at some point if you see through everything, you're blind. The point of seeing through something is to see something solid on the other side, something opaque, right? And if you continue to look through every cultural fact as a power dynamic, as a manifestation of some group trying to gain power over the other, well, pretty soon you end up in postmodern la la land where you can't even use language anymore. Was it Derrida who said that, joke that you can't even really know that I meant what I said in my book, or something to that effect.
Oh, no, it's a much better story about Derrida, where, he said there's nothing but interpretation. And then when he put his book out in a scholarly sense, people took it apart. And he basically said, wait a minute, you misinterpreted me. And they, this stuff, you can't stand. Critical theory, and let's look at these things just quickly, critical theory and then white privilege, because I want to point to a couple different, hopefully helpful sources on both. Critical theory notes that there is a problem. It is a tool for what's wrong. What it's not is a tool for building anything. So that's the first thing you need to know about critical theory, is that it just basically points out what's wrong. It doesn't have any constructive ability whatsoever. Secondly, even though it's a tool for analysis, I don't think it's actually even a good tool or the best tool, mainly because it gets the human condition wrong. And what I mean is critical theory draws the line between oppressor and oppressed and says everybody on this side of the line is good and everybody on that side of the line is bad, or vice versa. It does so in
very simplistic ways too. Like another a theologian I follow on Facebook pointed out this week. His name's Alistair Roberts, great guy. He said that critical race theory completely steamrolls over the fact that there are whole groups of so-called white people who had nothing whatsoever to do with the oppression of Africans, especially African Americans. So you can't say this. Okay, you're the Swedes. What do they have? What kind of white privilege do they have? Well, that steamrolls over those realities and completely ignores them. So it's too simplistic in that way.
Yeah, that's right. And because that's used, and this phrase white privilege really comes out of that, I thought Glenn Sunshine, who's been a longtime associate of the Colson Center, he does a fun podcast called the Theology Podcast. And they talked about this. And Glenn made a really great point about this. He said, there's no question that whites enjoy a set of conditions that put them in advantaged positions in culture, right? I mean, and I think and you can't always make it just about whether it's white or black. Sometimes it's socioeconomic or something like that. Mm-hmm. But certain people do have a step up, right? Sometimes that's the result of moral choices. Sometimes it really does reveal that there's systemic problems. For example, I've never ever thought that I'm going to get pulled over 2 blocks from my house asking me, are you sure you live in this neighborhood and did you steal that car?
Sure.
I have too many African-American friends who have said that's their story to know that it actually doesn't happen. Do I think it happens in every neighborhood? Do I think it happens 100% of the time? No, but if it happens 10% of the time, it happens way more than I would ever imagine, right?
Yeah, and the fact that for you and me, the police are basically pulling us over. It's an annoying experience. It's not something that we're
no, and there's no sense of fear.
Yeah.
That's right. It's not going to escalate. I mean, there's all kinds of things. What Glenn pointed out is that clearly there is something that has there are conditions that give people steps up in the sense that you might call it privilege. So the problem with the way we're looking at this is that we're kind of focusing on white privilege as if it's the problem, right? And the problem isn't in that situation that we just described, that you and I don't get treated that way. The problem is that African Americans do get treated that way.
Right.
And when we lock in on, you need to apologize for this. No, that's missing the whole injustice. The injustice is being done against those who are being treated wrongly. And that's the problem we should solve. And this, in a sense, gets at the heart of what's wrong with critical theory. It defines the human condition wrong, and it defines the human problem wrong, misses the fall, and therefore it's going to mess up on the solution. And again, we go over that in a wonderful What Would You Say video that we have at the Colson Center. You can go to whatwouldyousay.org, or we'll link to it in the show notes here at breakpoint.org.
Okay, we're going to take another break here. We'll be right back after this to talk about another story of this week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, another story this week that really caught my attention, one that I've been following because...
I call these stories the you ain't woke enough stories.
You ain't woke enough stories.
You ain't woke enough stories.
So J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series.
Feminist.
Yeah, feminist, down the roster liberal in just about every way you can think of, has offended the woke police and is now being subject to a really renewed effort to cancel her. But the thing is, J.K. Rowling is kind of too big to cancel. So in a series of tweets, she mocked trans inclusive terminology like people who menstruate, saying there used to be a word for those. And then she kind of played around and said, well, is it, wombin or wimbin or something like that. And despite the online backlash from prior so-called transphobic tweets, she's actually doubled down, and she actually wrote an essay a couple days ago on her website insisting that woman is not, quote, an idea in a man's head, and that trans inclusive language is, quote, dehumanizing and demeaning to women. She actually continued, and this is just the money line: when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. She also cites research from, actually, this surprised me, Lisa Littman, who has documented the rise of transgender identification as this so-called social contagion. So in other words, there's epidemics of young women, in particular in the UK, who come out as trans. And the reason that surprised me, John, is because Littman has just been excoriated over the last, year or so since her study came out as transphobic. So she suffered the same fate as Rowling has, and yet Rowling is still studying her work. This is something that we talked about on Breakpoint here. So it almost sounds like reading J.K. Rowling here, the arch Twitter liberal for years now, that she's on our side on this issue. It's a weird...
And even Harry Potter disassociated himself.
Yeah, Daniel
the woman who made him famous. Possible.
And Hermione, Emma Watson.
Hermione did too. Well, here's just one of the many, many, many inconsistencies of the whole transgender movement. I mean, we could start with the idea that, feminism was built on men can't understand women's experience. And now in the transgender ideology, men can not only understand it, they can actually fully appropriate it. Not only that, but here you have Harry Potter telling J.K. Rowling what a woman actually can be. Isn't that called mansplaining?
I think it is.
Well, and when is it okay to mansplain? It's only okay to mansplain in this. Look, here's my prediction, and I know predictions, as Warren Cole Smith used to say, are dangerous, especially predictions about the future. But
that's Mark Twain. Come on, that's not Warren.
Is it? Maybe.
I'm pretty sure it's Mark Twain.
It probably is. Look, here's the issue that you have is that these social movements, including the sexual revolution, others of the sexual revolution, have been driven by faulty ideology, faulty argumentation, and faulty science. But there's been at least an attempt to intellectually justify the positions of the L, of the G, of sexual liberation, of second wave feminism, and all that sort of stuff.
There's no attempt here. It's just a naked assertion that trans women are women.
The T has hooked its wagon and done none of the work. And I just don't think that it's going to sit well. Now, look, you and I could talk about, why male and female is not only biblically a reality, it's biologically a reality, it's genetically a reality. It's historically a reality. It's built into plants. It's built into animals. It's literally built into the fabric of reality itself. And we've done that before. I think, though, this point is something to be watched because, the feminist movement has had decades and decades of fighting for what they believe. And suddenly the T's are hopping on, trying to steal everything that they worked hard for without doing any of the work itself. And they do it in such, oftentimes T activists do it in such a dramatic, melodramatic sort of way. This isn't going to go away. The L and the G do not get along with the T. And you have stuff like this. Really, J.K. Rowling is what's wrong with the world. That's what we're going to point to.
Yeah, this is very reminiscent of what we were talking about earlier with critical theory proponents turning on each other and the snake sort of eating its tail. J.K. Rowling is where most progressives were just a few.
Yesterday.
Ago. This is not yesterday. This is brand new. But I'm kind of hopeful about this whole thing because she and so many other so-called trans exclusionary radical feminists, that she's a big figure. She's someone who could potentially shift the narrative here. And it seems like, because she keeps coming back to this, that she's not afraid to actually take
Hey, and that's a lesson. This is an important lesson, because how many people have we seen trip over themselves to apologize the moment they said something that was observably true but perceived to be, hateful or bigoted? And no one has yet said why what Harry Potter. Sorry, I keep calling her Harry Potter. Why J.K. No one has ever said
At
why
least call
what
her
J.K.
McGonagall.
Yeah, right. But nobody has said why what she said is wrong or hateful or bigoted. Just that it is.
Yeah.
And you know what this is going to demonstrate? Like Martina Navratilova, stick to your guns.
Yeah.
Stick to your guns. And Christian, don't trip all over yourself. If we have folks that don't even have the power of the Holy Spirit or truth ultimately on their side, that have the courage to not say things that are observably absurd, don't say it yourself.
Yeah. This regime rests on fear. Every single person who doesn't capitulate reduces its power to intimidate the next person, to deplatform the next person. And that's why even, this sort of thing, it's interesting to watch. This is a really cool story to watch. Well, we're out of time for today. Folks, come to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories that John and I mentioned on today's program. And you can also find tons of great content there with Breakpoint and the Breakpoint podcast. I just encourage you to really dig into it and check it all out. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.